Welcome to the Air Hill Church Sermon Podcast. We hope and pray that the following teaching blesses you.
I was thinking about a TV show this week. I don't even know if I watched an episode of it when it first came out, but it came to my mind when I was reading this passage. And the TV show, I think, premiered about 10 years ago on ABC, and then found its way, of course, to the streaming services of Netflix, Hulu, Pluto, and all of the above. And the show was called Claim to Fame. It was a reality TV show, so yes, that means that a lot of strangers were moving into a really nice house with lots of cameras. I'm not saying that that's wise. I'm simply saying that there's some entertainment value possible within that crazy relational scenario. But this was more of like a scavenger hunt on relational realities, because every single person in the house was related to somebody famous. And the point of the game was to figure out who was their famous relative. So there was not like living survivor style with limited food and a lot of physical activity. It wasn't like, seasons 1 through 30 of Big Brother where there was physical challenges and way too much dating. It was literally like, who does this person look like? What are their stories? And do I know enough from those entertainment magazines to pick up on some cues of where somebody lived or how somebody grew up? Of course, the show was hosted by some of the Jonas Brothers. I think one popular Jonas brother and then the forgotten Jonas brother. And I don't even know how this show or series ended, but it made me think. I thought of that because of this passage, because as we've spent over a month, nearly 2 in the book of James, it's like James has the greatest claim to fame or significance in the early church because of his relationship with Jesus. James is the brother of Jesus, and note that he doesn't spend as much time as we might think or assume talking about his relationship. He doesn't center himself. And that's going to become important because in James 4 and 5, he's having a conversation. He's leading some discourse about what we have at the center of our lives and our stories. He doesn't use those words, but I will show you through these verses how he's really asking about people's motivations and practices and where they place the center of their trust. This is a little bit of a review, and we've talked about this for several weeks, but James didn't always believe that his brother was the Messiah. We have an example in the Gospels of James actually kind of only like a brother could, making fun of Jesus. He's like, if you really are who you say you are, why don't you go to the festivals now and do your miracles? Like that's what he's talking about in the Gospels, because he's kind of in jest, playfully saying, I don't think you are who you say you are. And then fast forward, we see Jesus dies, resurrects, shows himself to followers and ascends, and then suddenly James is now an early church leader, fully convinced that his brother Jesus was the Messiah. As Pastor Brenda reminds us when we gather around the book of James, it's important that as we read his punchy lines, we remember they're coming from a heart of pastoral care. And I think also, sometimes a brother can have tough love. And yet, I would argue that all of us need someone in our life that would give us tough love. So I think James is almost so forthright with some of his recommendation or instruction because his relationship with Jesus was always familial. And so when he says brothers and sisters, and Paul says that, other writers say that, but for James it has a little bit of a texture or a tint to it because Jesus was his half-brother. And so he's inviting us into the beautiful mess of family life. And for him, it was both his family of origin and, like us, his second family. A chosen family, not necessarily chosen by us, but chosen by the Lord that we responded to in grace. Now, if my brother were here, and I hope I get to see him in a few weeks when I travel to New Mexico, he would probably share some stories that were less tough love and more just me being tough on him. My siblings, both of which are younger, lovingly and mockingly refer to me as their third parent. And the subtext is the third parent that they neither wanted nor needed. I was a rule follower, I was an overachiever, and I would often say, if you just did this, you wouldn't get in trouble. I was like, guys, people-pleasing is so easy. We should all do it together as a group of siblings. It will make everything go smoother in life. Probably true, but not necessarily healthy. But that was the advice that I would give. So he would probably say that was more tough than loving, and I would agree with him. He would also share stories if he were here and somehow we gave him an opportunity to kind of just share embarrassing family moments. Two would come up for him because they come up every time I go back to New Mexico, even though I'm not going back to new family members. It's the same people that have heard the stories for years and years. It's when I traded him. Do you remember those troll figurines or dolls with the hair and the eyes, like the purple or green hair? So did I make a trade for one that he really loved for some rookie baseball cards that I wanted to have? Yes, I did. I gave him the opportunity to own nostalgia before it was nostalgic. Does he believe I ripped him off for a Willie Mays rookie card? Well, he's not here to talk about it right now, but he did have a troll. So I did not steal. I simply made a trade. I wanted to say that, but that story is going to come up. My son hears that story every single time we go to New Mexico. Hey, your dad one time traded me this crazy doll, this crazy wild hair figurine for all my baseball cards. And I'm like, trade's a trade, buddy. Trade's a trade. I'm not proud of that. That was more tough than loving. But the example that will be brought out, not only when I'm there, but when I'm not there, is the time that I was curious, is a light bulb hot when it is plugged into a lamp? Or did my parents just not want me to touch it? Like, were they really protecting me? So I had my younger brother join me in a room. I happened to have a plugged-in lamp, and the shade was conveniently removed. And I said, I don't think it's hot when you touch it. It's only been on for a few hours. He did touch it. It did burn. I confirmed my parents were correct. That is dangerous. It was not loving. It was tough. That story will follow me for all the days of my life, and I just wanted to confess that to you. So that if you heard it from somebody else and you were thinking that couldn't possibly be true, it was true. I did learn that day. My parents were truth tellers. My brother has a sensitive skin on his hand and maybe a bruise that still exists, and he can hold his troll doll with slight injury, but he's going to be okay. James 4:13 through 5:6 is probably one of the strangest passages in the book of James to me, because it's both very intense and also I have so many questions at first glance. Like, there are some scriptures that you read and at first glance you're like, I think I understand. Faith, hope, and love, those are pretty big things. Jesus came back from the dead. What could that mean? Well, he was dead and now he's not. When you read a passage like this, though, it seems to ask certain things or instruct in certain ways that you're like, is that tenable? Is that possible? Could it really? I'm willing to do it, but could it mean that? And I want you to read with me, because as we read, we'll kind of get a sense together of what seems crystal clear and what's going to require a little bit more study. So James 4:13 through chapter 5, verse 6. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Shifting to chapter 5, verse 1. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. So that's very intense. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. Verse 5, you have lived on earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who is not opposing you. These are the words of the Lord. It's almost strange to say these are the words of the Lord, thanks be to God, after this passage. Like, I had to practice it because it's like, these are the words of the Lord, thanks be to, I'm not sure if I like this, or what does this mean? That's at least how I feel, even as a pastor, a.k.a. a professional Christian. I'm like, thanks be to the Lord. Did we have to pick this to talk about this week? Is this one of my favorite? I don't think anybody has this like tattooed or in their Instagram bio or like on a mug or Christian t-shirt. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have hoarded wealth. Corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. Like, those aren't necessarily bright images of hope. But James is actually doing some really important pastoral work in leadership. He is helping them to reorient their lives, their practical lives, which we could sometimes think of like as their non-sacred lives. He's not talking about how the church should operate, how the gifts should manifest, what songs they should sing. He's kind of talking about what they do outside of their gatherings. And he's really asking the question, what is at the center of their lives? He is not saying we have to say as believers, if it's the Lord's will. Oh, if it's the Lord's will, I will go to McDonald's later today. If it's the Lord's will, I will go to work on Monday. If it's the Lord's will, I will love my grandchild. If it's like that, maybe you've met someone like that. I had someone in my life who would say, if it's the Lord's will before everything. I love their heart. They were very annoying to talk to. It just took a long time because they would say, if it's the Lord's will, like before everything. Like, hey, do you want ketchup or mustard on the hot dog? If it's the Lord's will, I'll take mustard. Like, just tell me, you know what? No mustard for you, sir. I don't have patience. But I love that their heart was like, if it's in the Bible, I'm going to apply it. I love the heart. What James is getting at here is not adding like a Christian code to prefix all of our sentences. He's actually asking for something much harder. He's actually asking us to examine what is at the center point of how we live our lives. Notice that boasting, arrogance, evil, and pride are all coming up as the motivating root of what he's addressing. He doesn't come out and say, hey, you're rude, you're prideful. But he's saying, I know that you're dealing with that because of how you're talking. And then it seems to be tied to they're talking about doing things that probably would benefit others, but they're not doing it when they could. That's why he says, verse 17, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. So he's not saying, I don't like your travel plans, by the way, do good. He's kind of saying, like, your whole life should be centered on Jesus and doing good and not withholding. So then I had to ask myself, why do I, in my darkest selfish moments, withhold good when I could do it? Well, there's two reasons that I do that. One, to stay in control. And two, to create a dynamic of power so that I could be the rescuer and someone else could be the helped. I remember that when a few years ago, my apartment building underwent a terrible storm. Like, the roof came off of the building. And maybe don't, bring this up casually with my family because I was out of town, but they were there in the apartment when it happened. So it's flooding, water through electrical sockets. I mean, it was a terrible storm. DC residents were without power, some of them for a week or two. But our building, like, the roof just came off. Like, we were displaced from our home for 14 months. It was supposed to take 6 weeks. It was 14 months. Like, we were receiving money from the Red Cross. It's how bad the situation was. And I remember this humble moment where we are at an Airbnb where we had to live for a month. And churches, friends, campus ministry alum are just sending us packages because we're waiting for the insurance money to kick in and we literally don't have anything. And I remember that my son, he was younger, he said, you know how we donate things to those in need, like once or twice a year? He's like, now we're the ones receiving donations. And he viewed it as a positive, but it was like a hard pill to swallow for me. Like, he was right. And I realized for the first time how hard it is to receive help. I don't think I'd ever really understood that as someone that helps people or who has tried to be a blessing, but it was really humbling to get toys and clothes and cooking supplies. We needed it. I was grateful, but it was kind of hard to admit that like I needed so many people to just live normal. I say all that because it seems to me that in this passage, James wants them to be prepared to do good because there are people in their community that would be on the other side of receiving the good works. He doesn't want them to withhold, and it's very reminiscent of another piece of wisdom literature, Proverbs 3:27 through 28. James isn't plagiarizing, he's simply repeating. He's helping them by pointing back to something that they are probably familiar with. It says this in Proverbs, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it's due when it is in your power to act. Do not say to your neighbor, 'Come back tomorrow and I'll give it to you,' when you already have it with you." So it seems like it's not just me that sometimes struggles with doing good in the moment and wanting to delay, but it seems like this was a problem in human hearts. That sometimes we are uncomfortable being around those that are in need. But this is a great reminder. Don't tell someone come back when you could help them in that moment. Don't withhold. James takes it a step further. He says it's actually sin. It's missing the mark. It's not living in alignment with God. It's in rebellion to the ways of the Father. Verse 17, that's what sin means. When we know what we ought to do and don't do it. It kind of reminds me of the discourse on gluttony. Sure, gluttony in its simplest form could be overeating, but in the New Testament, gluttony, similar to the Old Testament, was really about hoarding resources or about taking too much for self when others around you were in need. There's actually a surprising number of verses in the Old and New Testament about hoarding wealth, and I think that's for two reasons. And I wrote them down, but one of them is this, is that, I'll put it this way first, spiritually, wealth can be dangerous. If that's too strong, you can write this slightly friendlier version down. Spiritually, wealth can be precarious. And here's why. Because it's very hard to obtain wealth and not let it obtain you. Do I have wealth or does wealth have me? I mean, James, later in chapter 5, is also talking about this reality that most of my AU students would be so happy to talk about, that isn't most wealth coming at the expense of the less fortunate? I mean, we're not reading Marx here. We're reading the brother of Jesus, James, where he's just saying, hey, not all the time, but wealth has a way in which it comes to one at the expense of another. And then he provides some very specific examples and says, the cries of the harvester who have not been paid by the wealthy have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. I mean, that's a very Old Testament prophecy of things are crying out for the Lord's help and for justice. So wealth can be something that I end up serving versus allowing it to serve me and those around me. That's why it can be dangerous. It can put the center of my life on what I can earn and keep and hoard versus what I can give and share. But it's also potentially dangerous because most people don't have well, that's enough. I've got enough money. I've got enough vehicles, enough homes. It's like this thing that you keep, it's kind of like food. You keep eating it, and then the next day it's weird, you're hungry again. It seems that for most people throughout human history, wealth is this goal or aim that continues to grow. And it often comes at the expense of others. These passages are tied together, right? The chapters and verses weren't added in Scripture until later, and they're helpful. But these are one continuous thought. So it opens up about, why are you talking about carrying on business and making money here or there next year when you're not really doing good or helping those with what you do have? And then it's saying you've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. So we are actually called not to live in luxury and self-indulgence, but to live so that others would be blessed. It reminds me of this conversation about privilege. It's important that we name the privileges that we have, but that we also leverage them for others. It's if you have some type of privilege or advantage or something in your story that's been a blessing to you, you shouldn't ignore that or look down on that. But the question that the gospel asks us is, well, how do you leverage that for others? Because the gospel asks us of our whole lives. How does your story become redeemed so that others benefit? Proverbs 27, 1 through 2 says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. Let someone else praise you and not your own mouth, an outsider and not your own lips." So it seems like James has this in mind when he's telling them, you sound really big in your plans. But if you were that great, you probably wouldn't have to say it for yourself. Others would probably say it. And then he's kind of helping them understand, like, gathering resources isn't what makes someone great. It's about helping, taking care of, paying attention to the marginalized, to those who aren't in that position of privilege. And so you might read this or hear me talk about this. It feels really kind of like a weird passage. But I think one thing that I have to mention, or I would be doing you a disservice as one of your pastors, is that if James were here, he would put you and I in the category of rich and wealthy. Like, it's easy to read that and think, I don't really feel like I'm self-indulgent, I'm not living in luxury. But if we look through, like, the global reality of humanity, we are in the proverbial 1%. But if we zoom out further to the historical reality of human nature, we are still in the 1%. And so even if we don't feel like we're rich, and it is hard to feel rich in Vienna. I mean, it is one of the most wealthy zip codes in America. It is top 5 most expensive places to live in Virginia, according to a survey that came out last week. And it's also highest PhDs per capita in the region. Highly educated, access to wealth. You might be like, I don't have a PhD, and I don't have a big yard. Hey, I don't have a PhD either, and I have no yard. So I get it. And yet, even though we may not be seen as rich or wealthy in our own eyes or in the eyes of those who we would perceive as rich or wealthy, whose homes or country clubs we drive by, it's still a message for you and I that we would not center our lives on what we can gain, but what we can give and share. James was dealing with something that was beautiful and messy that I hope we always get to deal with here, is that there were people from different socioeconomic realities in the community locally. He's helping them to take care of each other. It's why in other gospel communities, early church gatherings, there is that discourse that Paul talks about of like, hey, some of you are like eating a ton of food right before communion, and some of you don't have anything to eat, and there's not really a lot of sharing, and then people are kind of sitting apart. Like, it's about unity and togetherness. And that involves sharing what you have. So I can't bake a pie, and most people don't enjoy the sardines that I bring to church functions, but I do know how to make cold brew. So I bring cold brew occasionally. Because someone once told me part of serving others is whatever your weirdness or strangeness or uniqueness is, leverage it for others. I am not an expert on hunting or fishing or airsoft or paintball, but I read a lot of books. So I am passionate about the book stall. I am passionate about, hey, I have read some not great books, but I've read some great books. I'm just going to give you the books that you should read, and I'll take the pain of the books that were not great, and I'm not sure how they got published. My weirdness is like I have a love for resources that have helped me and I hope help you. James is helping to reorient them so that when they are not gathered physically for church or for study or for worship, that their lives would still be an expression of the study and the worship. And one of the ways that you can measure that is by how people spend their resources of time and money. In my conversations with college students, in closing, I'll share this story. It's people's Google calendars and their credit cards that are typically the last things that they surrender to King Jesus. But if you hold on to them, my fear is that they would hold on to you and then choke out your passion for Jesus. This is not a talk about more money for missions. Don't worry, that talk will come later in this year. This is not a talk about tithing. I got one of those that I'm sure I'll share at some point in the next few years. This is about like the reality of your formation and soul is impacted if you give into hoarding either possessions or even hoarding opportunities for good. That we're to live freely and open-handed. Henry Nouwen once said that we often can't receive from prayer because we've held on too tightly to what we want God to do for us. That we've not opened our hands to even receive the gifts He might want to give us. When I first heard that, it had just been after someone had led us in a group prayer, and I realized that even in prayer, my hands were clasped. Maybe because I was a homeschool kid and knew this was the way to pray, but maybe because it was a reflection of my inner heart. That's why you'll often see me now with open hands. It's not because I'm like trying to out-spiritualize anybody in the room. I'm trying to remind myself. Even as a pastor, it's not about me grabbing, knowing the doctrines, knowing the books, knowing what to do, knowing the verses. Open-handed, open-handed. I have to tell myself that. So you'll see me just open-handed. You're like, wow, he's really into worship. That guy's mature. No. It's because I need to be reminded of my neediness. The people that James was writing to forgot that they were needy and in need of grace because they had so much stuff. Possessions can possess you and I's heart when it belongs to Jesus. It is so hard to be dependent on Jesus when we can depend on ourselves for our day-to-day. And yet, that's the invitation of Jesus and the opportunity before us.
We are rooted in kindness. We practice patience with the path, and we experience transformation. We are Air Hill Church.